The hallway smelled of damp concrete and old carpet. Winter was nearly over, but these apartments still felt cold. Michael Grant climbed the stairs slowly. He carried a plastic bucket filled with paste, a roller, and a worn spatula. 25 years ago, he wore pressed shirts to work every day. He handed out business cards and signed reports in conference rooms. Tonight was different. His hands held rolls of wallpaper covered with tiny stars. The apartment door opened. A young woman stood there, maybe late 20s. She didn't smile or introduce herself. She walked straight to the small bedroom and pointed at the bare wall. "Please make sure there are no bubbles. And be careful with the corners," she said. Her voice was sharp, leaving no room for small talk. She handed him a cold bottle of water and went back inside. Michael stood alone in the quiet room. He set the water aside and pulled on his work gloves. As he dipped the roller in paste, questions filled his mind. Why was she so cold? What did these stars mean to her? And what exactly had he traded his old life for? Michael spread plastic across the floor and pinned the edges under his boots. His hands had changed. Once they typed numbers and held pens in meetings. Now they smoothed wallpaper against old plaster walls. He remembered his last day at the office. The letter was brief and polite. "Your service has been appreciated. We wish you the best." That was it. 25 years reduced to one paragraph. His neighbors had asked, "Are you really doing this kind of work now?" "At your age?" Michael answered by showing up at jobs like this one. His hands were still steady. His dignity came with him in his toolbox. He rolled paste onto the wall and thought about his old life. The stale coffee in conference rooms, the squeak of markers on whiteboards, the silence when the numbers didn't add up. Back then, people listened when he spoke. Now his work was quiet, just the scrape of tools and his own breathing. The apartment told its story in small details. A torn label on a storage box, fingerprints around the light switch, the faint smell of old detergent in the curtains. Every house had its secrets. Michael had learned to read them. Afternoon light came through the window and hit the wallpaper. The star pattern seemed to come alive in the brightness. This room would become someone's night sky, he thought. Behind the closed door, he heard her moving around. The way she avoided conversation reminded him of someone. He remembered speaking that same way years ago, sharp and impatient. Back then, he was Mr. Grant, the manager who made people redo their work until it was perfect. Now he was on the other side of that tone. He recalled a specific night, the last quarterly meeting before his retirement. The conference room was a glass box high above the city. The team had missed their numbers by a narrow margin. Michael stood at the head of the table, voice hard, pen tapping against the chart. "Redo it. I want clean projections by morning," he had ordered. A younger analyst, exhausted, had lowered her eyes. She had worked all weekend, but Michael hadn't noticed. He remembered the slump of her shoulders as she gathered her papers. Back then, he thought he was protecting standards. Only now did he realize he had been shaving pieces off people's dignity, one correction at a time. The memory lingered as he pressed a strip of wallpaper into place. The silence of this room felt like an echo of that old boardroom. Only here, no one was writing notes. Only here, the silence didn't belong to fear, it belonged to concentration. Outside the thin walls, he heard faint television voices from a neighbor's apartment. A soap opera laugh track bled through, then the metallic clatter of a pan. Life continued in its unpolished rhythm. Nobody in this building cared about balance sheets or projections. They cared if their doors locked, if their rent cleared, if the heater rattled less this winter than last. Michael exhaled slowly. He was part of that world now. By mid-afternoon, Michael was hungry. She had given him only that one bottle of water. No lunch, no snack. He kept working anyway. He pressed down corners and smoothed edges. His hands knew what to do without thinking. His knuckles ached. In his office days, his hands never hurt like this. The pain reminded him he was really here, really working. He almost welcomed it. As the hours passed, he remembered the meetings, where one late report could freeze the entire room. His voice had been iron then. He thought about the faces that left those meetings. Some people stayed, some quit, some carried the hurt with them. Now he stood where they had stood. Evening light filled the apartment. She came back to check his work. Her eyes traveled along every seam like a searchlight. She stopped at one corner. "This part looks loose," she said. Michael swallowed hard and fixed it without a word. It stung, but he kept working. He noticed a photo frame sitting on a cardboard box. A young woman smiled next to a younger man. Both were surrounded by cheap glittery star stickers. He didn't know what it meant yet, but he felt its importance. These stars weren't just decoration, they were memory. From the hallway came the sound of voices. Two women stood near the stairwell, their words drifting through the thin walls. "She's working nights again. Poor girl, barely home," one voice said. "Always carrying groceries alone. And that brother of hers, isn't he special?" The voices trailed off, followed by the slam of a door. Michael's ears burned. He wasn't sure if Emily knew her. Neighbors whispered about her, but the gossip painted her silence in sharper lines. He returned to the wall, pressing harder than necessary, smoothing paste until his arm ached. Perfection for her wasn't about beauty, he realized. It was about survival, about answering the whispers before they even began. Evening shadows stretched across the room. When she returned and pointed to the loose corner, her voice no longer sounded like criticism, it sounded like desperation. Michael fixed it without protest, but inside, his judgment softened. When the last strip was pressed smooth, she returned. This time she moved slowly. She carried a small lunch container and set it gently on the table. Steam rose from the container and disappeared. Her voice shook as she finally spoke. Their parents had died in a car accident 3 years ago. Her younger brother Daniel had lived in a group home since then. The place kept him fed but not loved. She had worked 2 jobs, saving every dollar she could. Tomorrow, she was bringing him home. "He comes back tomorrow," she whispered. She looked at the star-covered walls. "He loves stars. They calm him down. I wanted him to have a perfect night sky." Tears filled her eyes. "That's why I was so strict with you. It had to be perfect for him." Michael ate slowly from the container. The food was warm and good. His frustration melted into something else, understanding. He had spent decades chasing perfection for companies and reports and numbers. She was chasing perfection for love. He noticed the envelope she placed on the table. It was thicker than they had agreed on. He took only what he was owed and slid the rest back to her. "Use this for him," he said quietly. Michael packed his tools and walked around the room one last time. The stars were straight. The corners were tight. The room no longer looked empty. It looked ready, like a sky that would never fall down. At the door, he tied his shoes and looked at his hands. These were the same hands that once signed contracts and shook hands with executives. Tonight they felt more valuable. Worth wasn't in a business card, he realized. It was in what his hands could build for someone else. The young woman lowered her head briefly. The gesture held both sorry and thank you. He understood her silence. No words were needed now. The hallway still smelled of old carpet. His footsteps still echoed the same tired sound. But something inside him had changed. Perfection wasn't about numbers or promotions. Sometimes perfection was a corner pressed smooth without bubbles, a room made ready for a brother's safe return. That night at home, he poured himself a glass of water with an old lemon slice. He typed 2 words into his phone: star room. Below that, he added good work today. He thought again of his old business, cards neatly stacked, now forgotten in a shoebox. They had once opened doors, but tonight they felt weightless compared to his tools. His hands told a new story, not of authority but of care. Every bubble pressed out of the wallpaper was a promise. Every corner smoothed was a quiet act of love he didn't even own. He whispered to himself this was worth more. The next morning, Michael drove past the apartment building. He hadn't planned to stop, but his heart pulled him there. The front door opened. The young woman came out, holding hands with her brother. Daniel's eyes lit up with pure joy. They walked inside together. The boy was eager. The sister looked relieved. Michael rolled down his car window just enough to hear. There was laughter carried on the morning air. No words, just the sound of happiness and hope mixed together. Inside that room, under the wallpapered stars, a new beginning was starting. Michael turned his key and drove on. He had left something there more valuable than any job title he'd ever held. As the building shrank in his rearview mirror, he realized he had built a sky for someone else, but that sky had lit his own emptiness. He remembered the spreadsheets he once stared at late into the night, convincing himself numbers were stars. But numbers faded. Stars, real or painted, stayed. For the first time in years, he believed he had done something that might last.